Hello, this is Michael Canfield, and thank you for joining us today on the Dogwatch. A dogwatch is an evening shift of early or late duty, or the people who undertake it. This dogwatch considers the natural world and the things that help us experience it, from dogs to watches and everything in between. Ultimately, it's a place for us to go wherever curiosity takes us. As we get into the warmer weather of spring, many of us on the Dogwatch will start to think of road trips. One of the many great things about these trips is that they can afford us time to think about our lives. There's no more iconic North American road trip than Robert Pirsig's travels in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. On this Dogwatch, we have the pleasure to be joined by Mark Richardson, a longtime motorcycle and automotive writer, now writing for the Globe and Mail in Canada, who retraced Pirsig's footsteps in Zen and Now, On the Trail of Robert Pirsig, and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. In our conversation with Mark, we discuss how he decided to write his book on Pirsig, what he learned along the way, and how he thinks about Pirsig and the book now. Our feature today is the pump at the Wayside Rest Area, where Pirsig stopped on the first leg of his journey on Highway 55 out of Minneapolis. Mark stopped at what seems certain to be the same rest area that Pirsig used, and pumped the pump himself. Just several days ago, I made my own trip to this small rest stop. Although the pavilion is still there, the pump has disappeared. So where is Pirsig's pump? If you have any information about this, let us know, as we are on the trail of this important historical mystery. And now, let's get on to the journey with Mark Richardson. Mark, thanks so much for joining us today on the Dogwatch.
Yeah, it's cool to be here. Thanks, Mike.
So you have an interesting background living in England till I think you were about 18 and then moving to Canada where you settled and have done a real range of things. You've written widely on motorcycles and cars. I love the Lego Land Rover piece too.
Oh, you saw that.
I have to say. So, really a lot of different things. So I'm wondering, have you driven anything recently that you found inspiring?
Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky in that I write about cars for a living, right? Cars and motorcycles and trucks and things. So I drive lots and lots of different types of cars and motorcycles. And now, of course, we're all moving into electric vehicles. So I'm getting a chance to be to get to drive the first electric cars that actually start to make sense. They've been out for a decade or so, but they weren't terribly good. They're only bought by people you call first adopters. But now they're getting to be very good, and I get to drive them all, and it's kind of cool. I have a Mini outside at the moment. It's sort of an electric Mini, plug-in Mini. It'll only go about 20 miles or so on an electric charge, and the theory is that that's all you really need in a day. I need more than that, to be honest with you, but probably most other people don't. I don't know. But it's fun to drive, especially just in electric. It's like a big golf cart.
So is that your Mini or somebody gave...
No, sorry, no, that's a press unit. So I usually drive a different car every week, and I try them out, and I write about them in the Globe and Mail newspaper, Canada's national newspaper.
Right. So
everybody tells me I have the coolest job in the world, by the way, and I try to tell them that, look, every now and again, there are cool cars, but there are also just sort of humdrum stuff too. It's not always so cool.
Right. What do you have any highlight, like these are some incredibly cool cars that I've driven recently or in the last couple of years? Anything to make us salivate?
Oh, well, Rolls Royces and McLarens and things like that.
Just those.
If you go on to, if you know my address and you go onto Google Earth and you look down on my house, there is a McLaren parked in the driveway, which is kind of cool.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, my wife says, look, it just looks like we couldn't pay the rent and the landlord's round to have a word with us. So it does sort of stand out. The rest of the houses around me have, RAV4s and Civics, things like that. But
yeah. So how, before you came to writing about motorcycles and cars, how did those experiences equip you for that? Like, what trained you to be able to become a car and motorcycle writer?
Well, what I'd like to tell people is that I did used to be a real journalist. I worked for newspapers and covered daily news and all sorts of different types of news. and learned about journalism and how to be a journalist and how to write a good story. And I always specialized in feature writing, just getting your teeth into something rather than just banging out the headlines. And then sort of somewhere along the way, I just sort of progressed into vehicles because they're more fun to write about. A long time ago, I wrote an essay. I was working as a feature writer in Ottawa, Canada's capital, the Ottawa Citizen newspaper, and I was working there just writing about death and destruction and everything else that goes on. And I just wanted to write an essay about why I liked riding a motorcycle, because I've always ridden a motorcycle.
Okay.
Ever since I turned 16. I was born in Britain, like you mentioned, and in Britain, you could ride a motorcycle or a moped at 16, but
Wow.
you couldn't drive a car or ride a bigger motorbike until you were 17. So if you wanted powered transport at 16, you had no other choice than a moped. And so, hey, I wanted powered transport. I wanted to get out away from just my bicycle. So I bought a moped and I souped it up so it looked like a fancy motorbike and everything. And actually, from about 15 and a half, I was illegal. I rode around all over the place on this moped and discovered how great it was to just go off and look at somewhere and explore it. And I haven't looked back. So I ended up writing just an essay about motorcycles and why I liked riding motorcycles. And then I left that job. I did some other stuff. And then in the late 90s, I came back to Toronto, worked at the Toronto Star newspaper. And I went in to see the editor of the driving section. I said, hey, can I just write you an essay about motorcycles? Because I enjoyed writing that one, years before in Ottawa. And he said, hey, you know about motorcycles? And I said, well, I know some, yeah. And he said, well, our motorcycle writer just quit. If you can write me the odd piece, that'd be great. And I said, oh. So the next day I came back to him and I had 52 column ideas for motorcycles.
Wow.
And he said, hired. And he didn't pay me much, but that was okay. I just wanted to write about motorcycles. So I sort of cut my teeth from that. And then after a while, his job came up and I applied for it and got it as the editor of the automotive section. So I figured that I'd been writing all these columns, motorcycles good, cars bad,
Right.
which I didn't think was good for the editor of what was at the time the largest automotive section in they said, North America. And I sort of switched over to cars and, well, I haven't looked back.
Yeah. Super. And I feel like I wanted to start out by describing that one part of your journey led to you writing this book, Zen and Now, on the Trail of Robert Pirsig and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And I recently dug out my own pink copy of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Right.
In sort of as I've gotten interested in this and you were able to generously agree to talk to me. And I looked inside the cover and I realized I got it the year after I graduated from high school. And I didn't realize how it had been that long. And I've been rereading it and listening to it in the car. And I think it influenced me more than I think I noticed. So I'm curious, can you describe how you first came to Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and how that then led you to want to retrace Pirsig's steps?
Well, you tell me first though, Mike, when you read it for the first time, did you love it?
I liked it a lot. I think it influenced me. I had the overarching sense that I didn't understand it. And it's been interesting in looking back now. I'm not sure I understood the philosophical aspects, like all the philosophical things he's talking about, et cetera. But what I really liked about it, and I think I've drawn a lot of years worth of sort of puzzling about, is just this question of quality, about the classic versus romantic. Even though I don't think I internalize those terms so much, I think about that a lot, and I wonder how much of it sort of was at least planted, a seed planted by that book. So yeah, I liked it a lot, although I did feel and still feel, right, like there's a lot in that book, right?
Yes, there is.
That's an understatement. But yeah, I loved it. I thought it was love is a different, probably not the right word. I respected it and that it was serious and brought things forward that I thought were really important and wanted to learn more about, I guess is how I describe it.
And it just kind of clicked with you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know why I don't know why I decided to pick it up in the first place. I don't know where I heard about it, et cetera, how I came to sort of understand that it existed. But yeah, somehow I got my hands on it and felt like, yeah, I need to read this.
So before I answer your question, my other question, because I'm a journalist too,
Sure.
right? What year was this that you first read it?
Well, the date inside my book says 1990.
Hmm. Okay. So the reason I ask that is because it was published in 1974. He actually sat down to start writing it in about 1968, 1969. It's based on a road trip that the author Robert Pirsig took with his son Chris, who was, I'm trying to remember, I think he was 11 years old at the time, 13,
Yeah.
very young
Yep.
boy, that he took with his son at the time in 1968. And when the story was published, it was somebody called it a zeitgeist for the nation. That it really spoke to the nation in 1974. It spoke to the times of 1974, and other people who have been discussing it recently because the author died several years ago, and his widow Wendy has just published a series of essays on his work written by him, published them posthumously, called On Quality. And people have been saying, well, what he says still makes a lot of sense, but it's not quite so relevant for these times as it was back in the 70s.
Hmm.
I would disagree with that. I think that what he is asking for or advocating for in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, uh, and in his later book, Lila, which I think was published around 1990,
Yeah.
what he's advocating for is kind of a simpler time when you can concentrate on doing the job properly and you're not so rushed through with so many distractions. And these days, there are way more distractions than there ever were in 1974 or 1968 or whatever it is. I think that the message is even more relevant, that what you have to do is just step back, think about what it is you're trying to do, what you want from life, from this particular project, from your marriage, or from whatever it might be, and just step back and think, let's get rid of all the clutter, concentrate on what is important and focus just on that and get that done and do that properly. That's what Robert Pirsig was advocating way back when, and I still live by that tenet.
Hmm. I think one of the things when I was reading your account, right, there was some, I don't know, I felt like there's some parallels, right, in how you had sort of come about this book, right? I wonder now that you mentioned that Lila was about 1990, I wonder if I saw Lila come out and then was like, oh, I should look back at his first book, which was more famous. And then, because I did get Lila eventually, and I think I read it, although I don't remember much about it. It's about a a sailing trip or something. But so I'm wondering if you can kind of describe how you came to the book originally.
I think I came to it in the same way that most everybody else did. I'd heard about this book. When I asked people, have you ever heard of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance? Most of the time they have, but often, or sometimes, they have not. They don't know what I'm talking about. The book was published a long time ago, sold millions of copies a long time ago. And I say, well, have you ever heard of Zen and the Art of Doing Something? And they say, oh, yeah. And I say, well, that expression, and I mean, I see it all the time even now, Zen and the Art of Cookery, Zen and the Art of, proper gardening, that sort of stuff. That was based on an original book way back, a Japanese book, Zen and the Art of Archery. And the author, Pirsig, took his title from that. But people have heard of the book, but they haven't necessarily read it. And the only reason that I read it in the first place, I found it on my aunt who lived in Montreal. It was on her bookshelf, and it was the pink copy, and it had a motorcycle in the title, and I liked motorcycles. And I thought, hey, that sounds good. And I read the back of it, and it was something about a road trip, and I like road trips. I thought, oh, I can do that. I should read this book. And I began reading it, and this would have been in the 90s. Probably, actually, no, it was way back before then. Sorry, it would have been in the late 70s when
Wow.
I first picked it up off my aunt's bookshelf. And I just, I made it through the first 20 pages or so, and then I just drifted off because as the author himself said, it's not really about Zen and it's not really about motorcycles.
Yeah.
It's about something else entirely. And all I wanted to do at the time, and I would have been a teenager, I guess, was read about motorcycles. And it wasn't about motorcycles, so I put it down. Plus, it wasn't the easiest book to read.
Yeah.
You know, he gets pretty involved in stuff, and I wasn't interested. So anyway, I left it. I thought, oh, fair enough. And then a few years later, I was going to university, and I was thinking that I should do a course in philosophy, and I stumbled across this book again for some reason. I guess I'd probably stolen it from my aunt's bookshelf. Actually, that's true. I did. I stole it from her. Oops. So I stole it from her bookshelf, and I still had it sitting there. And I thought, well, this is about philosophy, and it's got motorcycles in it, and I'm older and smarter and wiser now. I should give it another go. So I did, and I probably read about 100 pages, and then my eyes just glazed over. He's gone on about ghosts and the machine, and he's gone on about Aristotle and Plato, and I still just wanted to read about motorcycles. And of all the people I've spoken with about this book, probably 95% of them, I would say, had the same attitude as me. They just wanted to read about motorcycles. And this was a very difficult, for many, complicated, involved book that was not at all what they expected. The number of people that I talked to who said, yeah, I started to read it, but I never made it very far. I didn't enjoy it. But I guess it was a good book because other people liked it. It's astonishing, the number of people. Anyway, I was the exact same way. And then I got older and no wiser, but I still like motorcycles. And I'm 40 odd years old, and I'm going to a cottage with my family, and I'm looking for a book to take to the cottage. We're just going there for a week. I've got young kids. I'm going to have my 41st birthday at the cottage, and I'm looking for a book on my bookcase, and there's that pink one that I'd stolen from my aunt all those years ago. And I thought, you know what, I should maybe give it one more try, because this is supposed to be such a great book, and I've never figured out why, but I should give it a try. And I took some other books too, Stephen King's and, decent things like that. And this time I had the time to devote to it because I was just at a cottage rather than, a few pages before bed. And I sat in a hammock and read the book. And when I got to the difficult bits, the bits where he goes off into whole theories about philosophy and the like, where before my eyes had glazed over, I just skipped over those bits. I thought, no, this is a great book apparently, I'm gonna do it. So I skipped over them. I thought, yeah. Anyway, back to the bikes. And I made it all the way through the book that way. And I remember that I finished it on my 41st birthday, lying in that hammock beside Rice Lake in Ontario. And I got to the end, and it sort of made sense, because it's a complicated book with the fact that you have an unreliable narrator called Phaedrus, and I couldn't figure out who this guy was at all when I was first trying it, but after it gets some context, you realize where it's all coming from. So literally, I got to the end of the book, and I thought, wow, that was a pretty good book. And I literally ended it, turned back to page 1, and then I read it again without a pause. And I read it and read all the difficult philosophical bits, and they all sank in, because at this time I had the context.
Right.
And I thought, this is a great book. This is telling me a lot. And I also thought, it's also a pretty good road trip. Yeah. It goes all the way from Minneapolis to San Francisco, along the sort of roads less traveled across the north, and meets interesting people and all of that. And I thought, you know what? I should do this next year. I should do this road trip. And maybe there's a book to be done from it. I'd never written a book before. I wanted to write a book. And I thought, why don't I tell myself right now that I will do this as a road trip? If I can justify it to my wife as a book that might help pay for the road trip, then she might let me take the time away from the family. I'll do it on my motorcycle, my old motorcycle, just like the author had an old motorcycle. And I will end in San Francisco on my 42nd birthday. And if you've ever read Douglas Adams, you know that 42 is the meaning of life. So it seemed to make sense to do this. So I did it. And I took the book with me, and I ended up giving it away to somebody on my return home. Actually, I regret doing that. I wish I still had that pink copy, but I have the black copy with the whole afterword from his 25th anniversary edition. So that's what counts.
Wow, that's a great sort of context and story, and probably, as you say, the way a lot of people come to it is sort of from being interested in a road trip or motorcycles, or it comes to it kind of obliquely, and then see that there's a lot more in it that actually applies to those pursuits. That I think things we like about some of those things actually he talks about, and his underlying message, as you mentioned, really does too. So after reading your book, I realized I may be on my way to being one of the Pirsig's pilgrims that you mentioned, because I live actually right off of Highway 55 outside Minneapolis, which is the road that Pirsig started his journey on. So I'm curious, how did you figure out like what exact road to take? I mean, he doesn't say exactly in the book. And I also wondered if you know where the water pump is. I know it early on. There's a picture of you with the water pump and all that stuff, and I'm kind of like, where is that? And how would I find out? So how did you figure out the specifics?
I did have some help, not a lot of help, but I had some help because other people had done this before. As you mentioned, there are people called Pirsig's pilgrims, and they're people who are just like me, who figured that, you know what, this is a good road trip. And maybe if I do this road trip, I might learn something along the way. So a lot of people would do the road trip. More often than not, they do a part of it. They wouldn't try and do the whole thing. They would, the trip itself goes all the way from Minneapolis through to Bozeman, Montana, where it pauses for a while, and then through Idaho into Oregon, and then down the coast from basically from about Bend, Oregon. It goes over to the coast and follows it down. And it's a pretty sweet trip. It's nice. It takes you on some wonderful wonderful roads like the Beartooth Highway in Montana. That's truly stunning. That's not really something that most people know even exists, but was built in the Depression as one of those ways to give money to people. And these people had sort of patched together what the route was, kind of, sort of. But even so, it wasn't exact. Pirsig himself often doesn't tell you the route. He tells you that he went through a strange little town, and then you can figure out when you get there that this town seems pretty strange because it has a building that seems to match the description of the book, that sort of thing. By the time I got to researching the route, there had been probably 2 or 3 people who had patched together roughly what it was, but they weren't quite sure where the right turnoff was for this or for that. And I had to figure out a lot of that myself. There was a route given to me by a fellow called Henry Gurr, Professor Henry Gurr from the Carolinas, who had a whole website devoted to Robert Pirsig and his writings. And he was very, very helpful with me with the book. Even so, even he had not traveled the whole route properly and was still trying to patch bits together. And he actually was in contact with Robert Pirsig, asking him, obscure questions like, well, did you turn left at the stop sign or did you go straight ahead and then turn left 50 feet later? And Pirsig said, look, if I'd known people were going to ask me these questions, I'd have kept better notes. But it doesn't really matter, said Pirsig. And people like me said, well, yeah, it kind of does. Anyway, we figured it out. I figured it out with the help of, I guess, 3 different people who were Pirsig's pilgrims. And I took the route that in the end did turn out to be pretty much the exact route. And at the very end of it, there's this big scene at the climax of the book, which is the meeting of the unreliable narrator with the reliable narrator and all of this stuff. And I managed to figure out exactly where that was. And I managed to get to that point. And nobody had actually done that before. It was really kind of cool when I realized it was happening. But you ask about the water pump. I can go into my notes and I can have a look and see where it is. But it's on a northerly route, as I remember. And it's off the secondary highway, whichever that one is. That you go out of Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minneapolis, you go out for an hour or so, and then you turn north about an hour up that way. And that's the sort of point where I realized when I was there, yeah, this is that same water pump, the one that's mentioned in the book. There's only a sentence about it, but this will be it.
Yeah. So you didn't know in advance where the water pump was exactly.
No,
I see.
no,
But
I would ride by, and actually, in this case, I stopped just for a break because you know what? I wanted to stop for a break because I was on an old, uncomfortable motorcycle in the same way that those two guys, well, those four people, wanted to stop for a break on their two motorbikes. So, we felt the same way.
yeah. So let's talk a minute about motorcycles. I have to say, I initially had a hard time squaring your background as an automotive and cycle writer with the motorcycle you chose for the trip. And
Yeah,
that's more about me than you coming to it naively, right? I'm
yeah,
thinking, hey, this guy's going to have a sweet bike. And you chose what I understand was a 1985 Suzuki DR600 dual purpose, which is sort of a cross between a dirt bike and a road bike, as kind of I understand it. So can you just contextualize the bike and how you decided to choose that one?
well, because it was my bike. It was the bike that I owned at the time. Uh, that was the easy answer. Um, and when I first thought I'm going to do this as a road trip in 1 year from now, having been reading the book on the hammock, the first thing I started thinking of was, well, what motorcycle should I take? Because in my job, I have access to all kinds of different motorcycles. And I can request a motorcycle from a manufacturer, and I'll tell them what I want it for, and they'll say sure or no or whatever. And to be honest with you, in this case, I could have had pretty much any motorcycle that I wanted. I remember BMW actually offered me a motorcycle, and then they said, "Well, if you'd like, would you like a 7 Series, which is the car, right? This $100,000 limo. Would you like to do it the 7 Series? Then you can sort of, it's nice and quiet. You can think." I thought, no, it doesn't, no, I don't think so. But unfortunately for me, I had to agree in the end that Robert Pirsig, when he did his ride, it was on his not terribly reliable, small and uncomfortable Honda Hawk, and I needed to do it on the same sort of bike. So I had ridden my old DR600 um, back in 1984 when I bought it new. I'd ridden the same bike all the way up to Alaska, and I'd gone to the Northwest Territories and down to Mexico. I spent a year living off my motorcycle when I was trying to figure out what it was I wanted to do with my life. And so I figured I should do it again on the same bike. It wasn't quite the same bike. It was the identical bike because my old DR that I'd ridden to Alaska was totally crapped out at this point. But I had found the identical model, the identical colors, everything on a barely used bike and in Toronto. And I bought that bike just because I wanted the bike. And then I fixed her up so that she would be okay to ride all the way across the country. And in the end, of course, it turned out that that was the bike that I always should have taken because that bike crapped out on me. The shock absorber broke, the brakes were dodgy, the tires wore out, all of this stuff. And it's the whole story becomes about living in the moment and appreciating what you have rather than I'm about to run out of road, I'm about to run out of motorcycle, whatever. Oh my God, the bike's not working right. If I'd had a 7 Series and never even had to think about the vehicle, it just wouldn't have been right. But in this case, I had my old bike and I had to somehow keep it on the road. And I had adventures because of that.
And you seem to have some skill as a mechanic too, right? You could work on it and do some of the repairs yourself, et cetera, right?
Well, I'm an enthusiastic mechanic. There was a point in Montana or Wyoming where I had to fix something and I ended up using an axe. My firewood axe was the only way I could get the bolt off. So I don't think any proper mechanic would ever do that. But enthusiastic,
Yeah,
kind of like dancing.
right. But you have some knowledge of the bike, and we're able to, in some ways, confront those things that Pirsig asks us to confront through his journey about how you deal with those things. So,
Yeah, well, you see, Pirsig was the kind of guy. He says right at the beginning of his book that he had his motorcycle fixed by some mechanics somewhere or another in town long before he was doing this trip. And they messed it all up. They rounded off the bolts. They punched a head through the top of the cylinder, all of this stuff. And he blames it all on the fact that they had the radio on while they were trying to do the work. How can you have the radio on when you're trying to do a good job? It's just distracting, says Pirsig. And now I think that's a bit extreme, but I understand, because I have the radio on when I'm working on my bike in my garage, I must admit. But it's the kind of guy he was. He was totally focused on what was important at the time. And he could fix his bike that way. But he also, although he was a trained mechanic and a certifiable genius, he also messed up, right? There was the time that he rode up north and the bike broke down. He couldn't figure it out. They had to hitch back. They trailered the bike back, and ultimately he found all he'd done was run out of gas.
That's an impressive story. Yeah.
Yeah, because he wasn't seeing the obvious. He was so busy trying to find the background.
So one question I had about the trip, you sort of came to the book. The text of the Zen and the art sort of toggles between the narrative of the trip itself and then Pirsig's ideas on, philosophy of quality and all those things, and a search for who he had been before. From what you learned and experienced, I'm wondering how we should think about the biographical nature of the book. Like, for someone who's just coming to that and reading it maybe for the first time, how do you make sense of what was going on with the narrator?
Well, it's kind of semi-biographical. Apparently, when he first wrote the book, he knew when he set off on this road trip in 1968 that he was going to write a book about it. He wasn't quite sure what the book was going to say. He knew it was going to be some way in which he could talk about the way that he felt about life. And when he originally wrote the book, there was no Phaedrus. It was all Robert Pirsig with his son having a road trip and thinking thoughts. And it just didn't work. He wrote the whole thing, 130,000 words. He tossed it. Nobody's ever, so far as I know, maybe Nancy, his wife at the time, she read it, but that was it. No, his editor certainly never read it because he realized it was wrong. And he needed to have some kind of narrative hook in there to make things more interesting. And he came up with the idea of Phaedrus. Nancy told me that it was her who suggested it. Whether it was or not, I don't know. This is a long time ago, and it really doesn't matter. The point is that the other thing that you know about Robert Pirsig, if you know only the bare bones about Robert Pirsig, is that he wrote this book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and that he had at one time in his life been certifiably insane. He was locked up in an insane asylum, close to where you live, actually, and he received electric shock treatment. Brutal electric shock treatment. This is the stuff of the 60s, right, where they tied you down and as he described it later, he said that they gave you a drug like curare and it made you feel like you were drowning just before you slipped out of consciousness. It's horrible. They gave him something like 30 zaps of this over a period of months, and then they released him back into the environment to get on with his life. He had gone insane because he was inclined that way. The guy was a genius. He couldn't wrestle his thoughts together in the way that he wanted, and his environment didn't help him at all. And he was teaching at the time. He was teaching philosophy and not really very happy. And anyway, he got the electric shock treatment. He was then released back to society. He had a pilot's license, and that was taken away, but he was allowed to ride a motorcycle, and that's how he'd gotten into motorcycles. And he was starting to get his life back and decided to do this road trip with his son, 11 years old, by the way. I couldn't remember exactly how. He was 11. And he rode off with Chris to San Francisco, and then the next year he rode off with his other son, Ted, up to Churchill in the Canadian Northland. It's something that he did. But he was trying to wrestle the idea of how to tell a good story that was also relevant to philosophy and relevant to him. And so he realized that he needed to have two narrators. He needed to have the guy who was riding the motorcycle, and he needed to have this other guy, which he called Phaedrus. And Phaedrus was the person from before the electric shock treatment, the father of Chris that Chris remembered from way back when. And the complication of the book, one of the many complications of the book that you don't really realize until you've gotten to the end of it, is that you think that Phaedrus is the good guy. You think that Phaedrus is the father that the son is yearning to be reconciled with, who he hasn't seen forever. And that the guy riding the bike is just this evil fella who's just all the son ever sees is the back of his head. But in fact, it's the other way around. Phaedrus is the bad guy, and Phaedrus is taking over the father who's riding the motorcycle. And you don't realize any of this until you get to that very end climactic scene in California.
Yeah, it's pretty moving. It's
very moving.
Yeah. So, that sort of Pirsig and his narrator, I wanted to turn to you, and I don't know if you have a copy of your book in with you now.
I have about a dozen.
Okay, so I have the hardback, and I wondered if you wanted to take two short sections, paragraphs, and wonder if you'd read them, and then we can just talk about sort of your own experiences. Would that be okay?
Sure, but I should warn you, I went on a book tour when this book was published.
Okay.
Which is every author's dream, right? And I have been very careful in this book and I was told to do this by my agent and by my publisher. I was very careful to just be the guy next door. You don't know who I am as the narrator, because I want me, for you as the reader, I want me to be the guy who lives next door to you, who is every man. And that's fine. When I went on the book tour, people were shocked that I was Canadian. What is this Canadian coming down here telling us Americans how to live our lives? The goddamn Canadians. And then, of course, I do the reading itself, and I open my mouth and say, well, hello, my name's Mark. And people go, what is this? Who the hell is this guy? So I don't know if it really worked out or not. But anyway,
well,
but I can give it a shot.
That sounds like it's more about them rather than you.
Oh, totally.
So on page 125, I really like this quote at the bottom. It starts, I found an old hockey stick, and I wonder if you could read that paragraph.
I've still got that hockey stick, or a piece of it. Yeah, I found an old hockey stick lying in a ditch and wedged it behind the panel up against the exhaust tubing. The wood of the stick was already cured, so the muffler's heat did not affect it, and it kept the panel and the bag away from the hot metal. But when I headed west across the prairie, the stick finally caught fire and melted half the panel, sending flames shooting against my jeans and burning through the saddlebag, toasting half the underwear inside. In Saskatchewan, a welder formed a bracket from the discarded chair to sit over the muffler, making it into a resting place for the bag just an inch from the pipe, but far enough away to avoid another mishap. So I should explain that paragraph. That particular incident didn't happen on my trip out west following the Zen route. It happened years previously, just going across Canada. And it melted my underwear and melted half the panel.
So I think one of the things I liked about it, obviously it's dramatic. And you're talking in the book, this is in the context of talking about your two motorcycles, Jackie New and Jackie Blue, as I remember.
Yes.
And just this context of things happen, and it's kind of how you deal with them and how you are in the moment. And I'm wondering, what makes you feel or made you feel close to Pirsig on that trip?
Well, I was lucky in the timing of this trip in that I did it in summer of 2004. And I was able, in the research for it, to find people who had been involved with the trip at the time and to be able to hook up with them. So I mentioned that he pauses for a while in Bozeman, Montana. He stays with his close family friends, the DeWeeses. And I did the same thing. I found them, Jenny DeWeese, who would still get people writing to her every year saying, hey, can I just pop by? I read this book and I found your address somewhere and I'd like to come say hello. And I stayed the night with Jenny DeWeese and her family. Stayed in a yurt on their property in the mountains outside of just south of Bozeman, Montana. And when you're sitting there holding on to Jenny's first edition copy that's inscribed to her by Robert Pirsig, talking with her at the time about how it was, then you're pretty close to Robert Pirsig. And then the next day when I woke up from the yurt and came up to the house, and she had a flat tire, and she asked me to fix that flat. because she'd hurt her foot and couldn't do it herself properly. And I climbed underneath the car, and all I did was change the wheel over. But I was actually changing the wheel over and getting it ready for her to be able to drive into town. And you'd better believe that I made sure that the wheels were properly torqued and everything was done right, and that I didn't have a radio playing in the background while I did that. So I felt pretty close with that. Another time was, of course, at the very beginning of the trip, I met with John Sutherland, who was the other guy on the first half of the road trip with Robert Pirsig at the time. John and his wife Sylvia rode their BMW with Pirsig and his son Chris on their Honda all the way out to Bozeman. And I met with John Sutherland, and I actually talked with him about how it had been. I didn't meet with Sylvia. She hated the book. She didn't want anything to do with it. She was around. They'd separated at the time, but she didn't want anything to do with it. And John Sutherland took me to the house that Pirsig had lived in. And that was the house where he had, on Otis Avenue, where he had written the book. And we went and banged on the door. And there was a nice woman in there, Susan Nemitz, who answered the door, and she knew about Pirsig, and she wanted to hear stuff. And so we sat down in their house and talked about it. And then they took me downstairs and showed me a few of the sort of things that were left over from the Pirsig's time. And one of them was the workbench in the basement. And Pirsig had actually fixed a drawer so that it opened and slid properly using the wheels from one of his boys' roller skates. And when I slid that drawer open and shut, I realized, yeah, I'm touching something here that's truly Pirsigian, as it were. When I mentioned it to the son, his surviving son, years later, he said, yeah, Dad never even asked me if he could take that wheel off my roller skates. He just took the roller skate. I wondered why my roller skates didn't work so well. But sure, something like that. But I mean, when I changed my oil on my bike in South Dakota, and I made a point of doing it right, tightened the chain, made a point of doing it right. I was trying to just take the time to do it properly, rather than thinking, well, I got to be on the road by 11 o'clock or whatever it might be. And I helped the motorcycle to run a little better because of that. And I try and do that now whenever I go off on road trips, though I'm really on such an unreliable machine.
Yeah. And I think then the second quote that I wanted you to read is on page 143, and it starts, a big part. And this one, while you're kind of finding it, one of the things that you're describing, I think, is what you find when you go on a road trip or on a trip, and certainly the hero's journey, or the idea of a journey going off, being changed somehow and coming back is as old as Ulysses, etc. But
sure,
I think it's as true now as it was then, and all the time in between. And it seems like I'm interested in sort of hearing you talk a little bit in this paragraph and in general about how you were changed. You were sort of wading into that with the drawer, which you actually mentioned in this, or you refer to in a way in this book or in this quote. I just wonder how you think about how you were changed by this experience.
Sure. Well, I'm just sort of trying to sum up the book itself. It's about halfway through my own book, and I'm trying to sum up what Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is about. And I do say, here it goes, a big part of the message of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance can be boiled down to a truism. If a job's worth doing, it's worth doing well. Pirsig would spend hours considering a problem and its solution, how to fix a motorcycle, how to build a workbench drawer. And I so wish I had the time in my own life to devote to such satisfying pursuits. But I don't. At any given moment, a dozen things are competing for my attention, and they usually get short shrift as the priorities get worked through. And the thing is that at this time, my kids were, 5 and 7, 7 and 9, I can't remember. They were young, right? 5 and 7, that's right. And they're a handful. And my wife didn't want to be left alone with the kids all the time. Motorcycles are a very selfish thing. You can't share a motorcycle easily with somebody, even when they're a passenger. It's not the same thing for the passenger as it is for the driver. It's not like a car. And when you have young kids, you can't take them on a motorcycle. I mean, legally speaking, their feet have to be able to touch the foot pegs. Safety speaking, they absolutely have to be able to touch the foot pegs or they're going to fall off, and that's not good. But they're just going to be on the motorcycle because they want to be with their dad or their mum or whomever. I wanted to be on the motorcycle on this particular trip because I just wanted to get away from everything and be on my own for a while and get my thoughts straightened out. And yeah, the grass was greener on the other side of the fence for me thinking about this motorcycle trip. It was a time in my marriage too, and I really didn't know, is this what it's all about? I have my kids, I love my kids, I love my wife, but this life is driving me nuts. It's not the life I used to live, and I feel so constrained. And it was the same thing for Robert Pirsig, but he was never quite so constrained. And I could not respect that with him. People have called me in this book, they've called me a very respectful disciple of Pirsig. But actually, I'm not really. I never met the guy. He never wanted to meet with me. I'm quite happy that I never met the guy. I don't think I would actually like him very much. I think that he abandoned his family too many times and at critical times for them. I don't think that he was a good father. I think that he was very, very selfish in his own mind. And I think he was a control freak, to be honest with you, who absolutely had to be in control of absolutely everything, which is another reason why he never wanted to meet with me, because getting back with your original question about autobiography, his book, Zen and the Art, is not very accurate autobiographically. And he certainly never talks about some of the bad things that he did, which I found out about. And I think I regret writing about them in this book. I think that I hurt him, and I don't think he deserved to be hurt by saying this. I mean, I backed them all up. I spoke to his family. They told me the stories, all of this stuff. But I think that he was the kind of person, he was a very private man. He told me in a letter, and we wrote half a dozen times, and they were brief exchanges right up until the end. And he told me once that he wanted to be the second most reclusive author in American history after J.D. Salinger. And I wouldn't let him do that because I wanted to write this story because I thought there were enough people who were interested in him and were interested in what he had to say. And when I first wrote the whole manuscript for this book, I didn't get into who he was at all. I got into his philosophy and I got into my own road trip, but I skipped the whole story about who Robert Pirsig was, mostly because I didn't know. But nobody was interested in reading that manuscript, and it wasn't until somebody read it for me and told me, yeah, the thing it's missing is about this author, this guy who went to an insane asylum. I want to know more about this kooky guy. So I found out more about the kooky guy slowly but surely. When I tracked down his former wife and his son, his surviving son, Ted, they told me a lot of the missing history that Pirsig would never have wanted to tell me himself. And I just didn't want to tell a story that was missing any important parts or that was untrue in any way. So I included it.
I want to be respectful of your time here, and I really appreciate that. I've learned a lot so far and really makes me want to know more. And I think a lot of it, at least for me, and I think most people who are trying to travel down this path, it's a way of trying to understand a lot of things about big questions and little questions in your own life. I'm curious, just as a last thing, what's going on for you? What's next? Do you have any other road trips planned? You've done a lot of road trips in your life. That would probably fill a couple other podcasts, which would be fun to have sometime about other adventures you've had. But other things coming up, projects or road trips or things that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, I like to do road trips. I love doing road trips. I got a couple planned for this year. I should tell you, this particular Zen trip coincided with my birthday, and I like to do things that coincide with my birthday for some reason. And so I'm about to turn 60 years old this year. When I was 50 years old, I traveled the entire length of the Trans-Canada Highway from Newfoundland to Victoria, BC. It was 7,000 kilometers. That's more than 5,000 miles.
On a motorcycle?
No,
Okay.
I wasn't stupid. I'd pulverized my back end on the Zen trip. This time around, I phoned up General Motors. They gave me a convertible. But I realized on another road trip, one that I took in an RV with my family, I realized that the Trans-Canada Highway is exactly the same age as me. I was born on the day that the Trans-Canada Highway was officially opened. And that was very relevant. I'm a big believer in fate and coincidence, these things happening. So I realized that was when I was 49 years old, and next year was going to be 50 years for the Trans-Canada Highway. And I realized, wow, I got to do this. So I quit my job at the Toronto Star, and I got in a Camaro, and I drove the length of the Trans-Canada Highway. And on my 50th birthday, July the 30th, I was at the top of the Rogers Pass, which is in British Columbia, which is where the Trans-Canada was open 50 years ago to the day, and made a point of being there and talking to the CBC for what it's worth, just to commemorate the day with my youngest son. So that was
wow.
Cool. But now I'm coming up to 60, which is another big sort of round number thing. So what I'm going to do this year, it's much less ambitious, but it's just as important. I live outside Toronto, so I'm getting into a Mazda Miata. Mazda's giving me this car, and I'm going to write a story for the Globe and Mail. But I'm getting into Mazda Miata, and I'm going to drive with my wife to Lake Placid and go up Whiteface Mountain. You can drive all the way to the top of the mountain, which is about 4,000 odd feet, and look out over Lake Placid, and it's gorgeous. And then I'm going to move on, and on my birthday itself, Saturday, July the 30th, I'm going to drive to the top of Mount Washington, which is the highest point in the East. And thanks to Teddy Roosevelt, you can get an elevator, the final couple of hundred feet to the very, very summit. You can drive all the way to the top of the mountain, and then you can stand on the absolute summit and look out over America. And I think that that's important to do on my 60th birthday.
Wow. That sounds like a fantastic trip.
I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you spending this time with me. And also, I was driving in this morning to work with my son, and it just happened to be the end of Zen and Now. I was listening to it on an audiobook, and it was an incredible moment to just be on Highway 55, listening to the end and talking to my son. He was asking some questions. We were talking about really the end of the book, which I hadn't rehearsed. I hadn't orchestrated. It just sort of happened. And the fact that we were going to talk today, like you said, fate and how these things are really meaningful. And part of what set that in motion is, you agreeing to spend some time with me and talk to us. So thank you so much, both personally and for the listeners, for joining us today on the Dogwatch.
It's been my pleasure, Mike. Thanks.
Thanks again to Mark for helping us learn about Pirsig's journey and his philosophy, and for inspiring us to take road trips of our own. Our music credit today is Whiskey on the Mississippi by Kevin MacLeod, courtesy of Creative Commons. Until our next shift, this is Michael Canfield thanking you for joining us on the Dogwatch.